Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming. Australia has a long history of big trade debates during Federation when the protectionists won out, and then in the 1970s and 80s when the tide turned in favour of free trade and less interventionist industry policy. Tonight's conversation is part of what's an ongoing story reflected in our topic, Tariffs and Trade. Is a reset needed? Just as importantly, tonight's conversation and the mission of Brisbane Dialogues is to demonstrate it is still possible to have not only civil, but productive and enlightening public discussions between people and experts who have different points of view, or even outright disagree. We are delighted to be co-presenting tonight with the Economic Society of Australia, Queensland, the first full co-production of a big dialogue in Brisbane, and a model for others around the country. I'm your MC, Isabel Barton, and I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Queensland studying mechatronics, engineering and computer science. Although tariffs and trades may seem far removed from my field of study, I would counter that without a global supply chain, I couldn't build a single robot. Furthermore, the broader question on how our economy runs, how countries share and distribute resources, are actually questions that are important to all of us, important to the distribution of job types here in Australia, and important to the independence of Australia, and so much more. Our co-producer, ESA Queensland, promotes discussion of the debate about economic issues and economic policies, supports the training and professional development of economists, and encourages the study and teaching of economics. The Brisbane Dialogues, evolving into Australian Dialogues, is the country's first dedicated civil discourse or bridging organisation with the ultimate mission to support other organisations to conduct across-the-aisle discussions on big ideas and issues, especially contentious ones. It is an entirely independent, neutral, non-partisan, volunteer-based community organisation and aspires to being intergenerational and inclusive. The Big Dialogues have been running for over 5 years at the Tivoli and Princess Theatres, bringing people together across divides, ideological, generational, and otherwise, enabling in-depth public conversations on big issues and challenges, modelling better public discussions to inspire others to do similar. Big Dialogue events have now also been held in Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, and there is a growing pipeline as other organisations emerge to collaborate. The next Big Dialogue is a collaboration with Ormond College in the University of Melbourne on the 4th of September on equity aspects of the energy transition, the third in an informal series which began here 2 years ago to the month. Now, I would like to introduce the Brisbane Rule. Created at the launch of the Dialogues, it always bears repeating. It's a variation of the Chatham House Rule, which many of you will know, which has been adapted for public events in the digital age. All participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on characters, before, during, and afterwards, online as well as offline. Now to housekeeping. Mobile phones on silent, please. Fire exits are clearly marked. Female-only toilets are at the entrance at the far left. Others are next to the lower bar. Please feel free to move around as unobtrusively as possible during the discussion if you need to or want to get drinks from the bar. And that's it for housekeeping. It is customary at Big Dialogues for the MC, on behalf of all present, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the place where we gather and converse by referring to a principle or element of dialogue in Aboriginal culture. One key element that resonates with me is deep listening, Dadari in some languages. Miriam Ugana, an educator and artist from the Northern Territory, said on the term Dadari, "We could not live good and useful lives unless we listened. This was the normal way for us to learn, not by asking questions. We learnt by watching and listening, waiting and then acting." It's a pertinent point that sometimes by asking questions, we actually bias the outcome or listen for rebuttal, rather than for understanding, which is essential for constructive conversation. On behalf of the Dialogues, I'd like to thank at least some of the many people who have contributed to tonight's event, especially our speakers, all very busy people who have volunteered substantial time and effort on top of their normal workloads. And to our major in-kind event sponsors, Steve and Dave Selswick, owners of the Tivoli and co-owners of the Princess, and their staff, who have supported us through thick and thin for 5 years now. We simply could not have done what we have without their support. I would also like to acknowledge regular sponsors, the UQ Liveris Academy, who have become an all-round event partner for 2 years, and the Pure Gold Films, who have recorded every big dialogue in Brisbane. Thanks are also due to the premium ticket holders who have donated tickets, and particularly the buyers of the conveners tables, who are Charles Keffel, who donated 2 and has flown all the way from Melbourne to be here. Steve and Jane Wilson, who are co-owners of the Princess, Jean Tunney of Adept Economics, and Dino Noble through Rebecca Landon. Their support enables our inclusive ticket pricing and makes the big dialogues model viable, essential for the national expansion. And last but not least, a huge thanks to the small band of volunteers led by Nasharan Lyons tonight, who enable this all to happen. Before introducing the speakers, I'd like to encourage everyone to text questions throughout the panel to the number listed on the back of the sheet of names on your table. If you don't have that, let me just quickly read the number for you, so get ready. 0411 407 996. That is 0411 407 996. Succinct, relevant questions with names given may be used later. There will also be time for a few live questions from the floor. You will also see a link to carry on the discussion online after the event. More on this later. And now to introduce the speakers. We have Louisa Coglan, Professor in Economics and Program Lead at Behavioural Economics Society and Technology Centre at QUT. Dan Ryan, Founder, Executive Director of National Conservative Institute of Australia, General Counsel/Lawyer, Board Director and China Expert. Anna Fedeles, General Manager of International Operations, Trade and Investment, Queensland. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Ian Walker, Public Policy Expert, Arts Supporter, and former Solicitor and Queensland Cabinet Minister.
Well, thank you, Isabel. Let's talk tariffs, folks. It's an interesting topic, and for many people, the first time probably it's come to their attention has been the recent kerfuffle within the world about a change in tariff policy. But in fact, there was probably a big dialogue about tariffs not a decade ago or 2 decades ago, but maybe a century ago. It's not a new topic. Dan, give us a bit of the sort of history as to when people started to toss tariffs up into the air.
Let me just do it by way of introduction, say in 2000 is when I sort of started my career, and I started in China working for a Chicago law firm, which has just opened up an office there, and it's a little bit famous because 2 young, then unknown lawyers called Barack and Michelle met there. But it was the beginning of China's entering into the WTO, and like no doubt other panellists, I was free trader, self-evident. It's obviously just backward and unserious to think that tariffs or that trade policy we should be heading towards anything else but a sort of universal free trade zone. And sure, there might be compromises here and there, but no one should be in any doubt about the end goal. And it was really over the last 25 years that I realised, along with others, that at least with China, but then beyond it to many other countries, that theory doesn't work nearly as well. Right. Free trade didn't bring peace. It didn't necessarily enrich many Western nations in the way it was intended. Mm-hmm. And if you go back into history, these debates that we're having tonight existed, like you said, in the late 19th century. They certainly existed at the American founding.
Well, we'll go back to that in a minute, because actually I should have asked each of the panellists just to introduce themselves as to how they fit into the topic. Anna, you're right at the cutting edge.
Yeah, so I work in Trade and Investment Queensland, so our job is to help Queensland companies get out into the rest of the world and to also attract foreign direct investment into Queensland to improve the economic situation that's here. Prior to that, I worked for the Australian Trade Commission and doing the exact same thing at a federal level. So I guess what I would say is what I see it is more at that practical level when you're actually starting to talk to companies and hear from them at the coalface. And I guess when I was in the federal system, it's that initial conversation when we're starting to consider an FTA with another country or another region. Why would we do it? What are the reasons behind it? And I guess we can cover some of those off a little bit later.
Sure. And Louisa, to paraphrase the song, what's a nice person like you doing in a place like this?
Well, I'm asking myself the same question. So I can't talk to the lofty same credentials as the other panellists. So I bring to the stage an economics background. So I'm a professor of economics. But you can be comforted by the fact that most of my career has been spent in terms of education. So, and educating non-economists, so first-year students, introducing them into economics and also introducing them into the arguments of international economics, what underpins that, what the advantages and disadvantages of globalisation. So whilst I have these academic credentials, I like to speak to a different pace. So.
Great. So Dan, before I so rudely interrupted you, you were talking about the historical context. When in the world's history did this debate sort of hot up or start?
Well, I mean, it's questions about trade policy have existed since Marco Polo went to China, or the Romans started importing wheat from Egypt, right? So in a way, they're not new debates, but there has, I think, in Australia particularly, in the 80s, developed a notion that we solved all these problems once and for all. Like in the past, no one really understood economics the way we did, or the way trade policy the way we did. And that's why it's been such a shock in the last few years to have this, very bad orange man in the United States sort of like start to raise questions about trade and talk about how China's stealing jobs from the United States and deindustrialising the United States and elsewhere. And there's been a kind of visceral reaction in the Australian body politic because I think no one has actually thought in a fundamental way about trade policy like they did in the 80s to a certain extent. Like I said, they think they'd solve these questions for all time. And it's because it didn't pan out the way it was ultimately intended that these questions have arisen. And it's not simply, the question with trade, it's what people fail to understand, what I've failed to understand, frankly, for a long time, it's not just an economic question. Trade within a nation, there should be no tariffs. There should be no tariffs between Townsville and Tarcoola and Taree or whatever. Between nations that are very similar economically, there should be closer trading relationships. Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Britain. Although famously people like Menzies and others didn't think British manufactured goods should come into Australia duty-free because they wanted to build up our own industrial capacity. But with other nations that have a very different social scene, a lot of cheap labour, different economic systems, you have to be very prudent about the type of engagement that you have. It has to be a temporary thing. It has to be closely monitored. That was actually the case, at least in the United States, prior to 2000, where they had something called an annual renewal of permanent normal trading relationships with China. But since its entry into the WTO, that's all been off bars. And we in Australia have just continued to sort of push ahead, and there's been no real reflection about the world we now live in, not the one we want to wish we might live in or that we might wish to bring about. And we need a kind of new realist approach to trade rather than one which is founded on these idealistic or sort of utopian notions that...
Well, let's get to the present time a little later, but going back into history, and Louisa, you might be able to help with this, with your global perspective. I mean, what drove the original ideas of tariffs? Were they, merely blunt-edged trade things, or were they ways of punishing countries or favouring countries? Is that something you can help us with in the sort of historical perspective?
So, well, you can... So globally in the last 200 years, the world has transformed. So it started with the first industrial revolution, which quickly segued into the second industrial revolution. During those times, we saw increases in output, massive increases in productivity, and developments of markets. So trade policy developed over those times, so at different paces in different countries. So some of the arguments for protectionist policies was that those countries that were slower to join that industrial revolution, so used them to allow space for new industry or for that industry to develop. So we have used trade in the past to secure particular types of goods. So, Dan, we've spoken about this last week, particularly things like defence, for example. So we have our own homeland security and we make the goods in our own backyard. So the problem with that policy is that it constrains, and it means that your businesses can expand to scale. So once you open up the markets, you can open up the scale. So that generates opportunities for employment, and importantly for us as consumers, it generates a lot more choice as well. But we have, you're quite right, we flip-flop between these debates. So now, sort of coming into Industrial Revolution 2, going through Industrial Revolution 3, and we had 2 major world wars during this period. We have seen unprecedented, historic economic growth globally. So we can speak to statistics such as GDP. Well, GDP is a bit of a blunt-edged tool. It's just the production of goods and services, so stuff. And that has risen exponentially. So what we can't say, though, which is some of the issues that you're speaking to, is who's reaped the rewards of that. And that's a question of the distribution of those spoils. And it's something we struggle with as nations. So who keeps the rewards? Now that's a domestic policy problem in terms of how you distribute those returns to that trade within your country. But we flip-flop between. Now, no surprises, I'm not from these parts, so I can't speak to Australian trade policy. But I have, some great anecdotes of what I can bring to you from the UK. So post-World War II, Churchill really pushed the agenda of free trade. So he cut his teeth on that very, very early. So convincing workers in Manchester on the shop floor that trade was prosperity that everybody could share in and that they would be better off as a result of that. So as a Conservative leader, he had the support of the working man. He later, post-World War II, took that to Europe, and this started the discussion about the common market, and ultimately the development of the European Union, of which the UK was part of. So I lived through, in Australia, so I was an observer, but I lived through that debate of the UK withdrawing from the EU, and they are now living through the reality of that.
Louisa, can I just tease out a particular point you made there? So you talked about the Manchester shipbuilders, I think, was it? So is your point that if free trade was going to disadvantage them, is it they were going to be disadvantaged by free trade because competition would open up?
No, they were going to be advantaged by free trade.
Your point, I think, then, is that sections of the community that would be disadvantaged, there was a local political issue then in distributing wealth within the country so that the disadvantaged groups by free trade could pull themselves up or change jobs or get into I mean, was that all part of what the system was about? The free trade system to make people move about into the more effective and economically positive workforces.
Well, we can sell an argument, can't we? So we can convince everybody that they're going to be better off as a result of it. Then it's actually up to the incumbent government to follow through from that and make sure that those spoils are distributed fairly and equitably. So whether that happens or not is really determined by domestic policy at that particular time. We see economies transitioning through difficult periods, and we see that redistributive process pretty much largely staying the same. So in America, we've seen that middle income America, that really benefit from manufacturing, has suffered deeply as a result of that manufacturing moving to Australia. So that's one particular group in America. Other households have benefited from that with access to cheaper goods, more variety of goods, which means that the dollar in their pocket goes further. What we do with the people as we transition through, so that sort of creative destruction process, is it's the responsibility of the government to redistribute those resources, to ensure that those people are protected. Now, there's various ways that you can do that. One of the ways that we do it, we have been doing it in Australia, is through education. So if you increase the educational abilities of your population, so we have a target of getting every 50% of the population through a tertiary education, so you lift their ability to move into the new manufacturing industries that are developing in this global world space. But everything's constantly shifting. So economies feel like they're very reactive, but they're not. Things are slow moving. Things happen at a very, very different pace. So we can talk, then we can have a really good discussion about whether Trump's trade policies have been successful. So I'd rather not, because I don't think that the data is there yet. We need to work through that process. So when Trump was first in, for example, we saw some of the impacts of that trade policies that he began to introduce during his first term, coming out substantially sometime after he left power. So it's very, very difficult to kind of track these processes and remember what they were a consequence of. So rising unemployment in a later time space, 2 years later, isn't necessarily linked back to a punitive trade tariff policy years earlier.
Can I move down to Australia, say 125 years ago? And you said in your comments before that it's obviously pretty clear that Brisbane should be able to trade with Broome, should be able to trade with Bendigo, but that wasn't always as clear. And in fact, the big political fights at the time of Federation were exactly about protectionism and free trade.
Yeah, but you're slightly mischaracterising it. I mean, I don't think for example, today, the real estate developer in New York, he's not in favour of imposing tariffs between New York and California, right? So everyone agrees within a nation state. Everyone that is in favour of trade realism agrees that within a homogenous nation state, it should be a free trade regime. There's no point. But once you start dealing with international trade, because nations compete against each other and because nations owe a duty to their citizens, you do need to adjust that policy depending on who you're trading with. We talked about Churchill in 1900. He started off, we famously jumped from a variety of different parties back in those early days. It was quite an interesting dynamic time. But Britain in the late 19th century engaged in unilateral free trade. So unlike America, which had a tariff wall, unlike Germany, which had a tariff wall, so Britain was relying increasingly on production of importing manufactured goods from Germany. It was actually ended up exporting, I think at one stage, a lot more coal to Germany than any other export. It was its most important trading partner. But, spoiler, sometimes very close trading relationships do not end well. And that's the scenario that we need to think about at the moment. I mean, more industrialised nations, all things being equal, beat less industrialised nations. Australia used to have in the 50s and 60s, I mean, we used to produce planes, then we produced cars, and now we don't produce anything. We have a real risk that our metal processing industry will shut down. We have about 5% of our economy which is devoted to manufacturing. If we lose that, it'll be more like 3%. They are sub-Saharan levels of economic complexity. So you might throw some government money to try and produce subs or buy this, that and the other, but that's not, you want to have a nation which is more than simply a provider of primary produce, because at some level the ability to have an industrial base means that you can not only defend yourself but you have some control over your economic destiny. Yeah.
And Dan, the flattening of that production output, to what extent or not is that linked to free trade development over the last couple of decades?
Well, I think it's fundamentally linked, because the problem is we tell our story, Hawke, Keating, Howard era, reforms, weren't they fantastic? And there was some useful stuff, necessary rejigging of our economy at that time to take advantage of the fact that we were living under an American hegemonic sort of regime. You could do stuff with that type of protection that you couldn't do in the 1930s when you had competing currency blocks and a whole lot of other different things. But it's a different sort of time now, and you sort of need to adjust to the weather. And we've created a situation in Australia now. I call it the red zone. If you're in the red zone, it's incredibly hostile to production, incredible taxes, incredibly high, all sorts of other regimes. If you move out of the red zone into wherever, China, Thailand, Bangladesh, you can then import your goods into Australia duty-free. We've created this affluent, wealthy market, well-regulated market, but you've incentivized all sorts of production to get out of Dodge. And that's not actually, it's not a healthy thing. You can't simply, even if it's economically advantageous, there are unrealised national security and social costs to that. Well, if it's such a happy kind of story that we've been told about the Hawke, Keating, Howard era, why is debt, sovereign and personal debt beyond the imagination? Why have we only created like 44,000 jobs in the last private sector jobs in the last 2 years? We're not creating new manufacturing industries in the way that we did in the 50s when we had a much more prudent, realistic approach to trade policy.
Okay, Anna, I'm still going to keep with history, but much more recent history, and you've been deeply involved in the last recent past with what seems to have been a pretty universal trend towards free trade around the world. So can you just explain how that sort of worked out in a day-to-day way in your job, for example?
I think it's also just worth commenting on what you said as well. I think there's an element of this, but I think they're not sort of mutually exclusive in a way. I think you can have a system where you can have free trade agreements and you can look at duties and tariffs and these kinds of things. But I think what you're really talking about in some ways is outside that regime and inside a domestic policy setting where you incentivise and you heavily invest and in some cases create non-tariff barriers in protectionism of industry. So I just moved to Brisbane from Europe and I can say, you know, it's a free trade environment, but it's also a heavily protectionist environment. They are heavily investing in their industry. They subsidise their major companies, their major manufacturing companies. They then generate income and jobs back into the economy. But every time something goes wrong, the government then heavily invests back. So it is... one can say that's not free trade at all, right? That's in some ways protectionist because the government is in fact investing back into these companies. But I think they're then using their FTA regimes to then take that trade, that product that they manufacture and develop and then sell it to others. So it's something that where we've done one part, we've created the regimes for ourselves. We've created a massive FTA regime. I think we've got 18 FTAs, like 30 economies. It's one of the widest FTA regimes in the world. But the second part of that is probably not what's happening, and I think we haven't in some cases we've let that manufacturing go, whereas other economies that we would be competing with, our friendly economies as well as the non-friendly, are in fact heavily invested in the development of their manufacturing industries.
Dan or Louisa, a reaction or response?
Well, just to be clear, I'm not just talking about non-tariff barriers. I actually am saying all these free trade agreements that were negotiated over the last 30 years need to be reassessed in light of current circumstances. At the moment, in Australia, on a bipartisan basis, we are in favour of an agreement with China that allows 100% of manufactured goods to come in duty-free. You will never have any type of serious manufacturing in Australia as long as that continues. So, but it is very hard to get through to politicians because they're a bit baked into the kind of 1980s mindset. We don't live in 1984 anymore. We don't live in 1994 anymore. It's a long time that has passed since that time, and we need to get real. Just one little thing I was thinking of. If nothing else from tonight, I think people need to get over this sort of linguistic conditioning. Protectionist is seen as like an epithet. It's a bad word, and tariff is almost like a trigger word. People, react to it. But protectionism, I prefer trade realism, but it's protecting something is a virtuous thing. When did it? Because a state owes a duty to its people at some level. Where do we get to a situation where that was considered a bad word? And I mean, Trump likes to talk about tariffs being the most beautiful word in the English language, like provocatively, but say it to your partner at night before you go to bed. Whisper it in your ear. It needs to be a word that engenders sort of love. And I can see some girls sparkling in their eyes, and and I can see you blushing too. So you can see a lot from here. But that's the sort of thing. These words have been we've been conditioned to think of them as automatically bad, and they've also almost impeded clear thinking on trade policy overall.
Louisa, what will your pillow talk be tonight in tariff terms, and any thoughts on those points put forward?
I don't think I will be saying tariffs as the last thing I say to my partner tonight, or maybe I will. We'll see how much I have to drink. So, I'm really interested in the manufacturing argument. So I talked earlier about these industrial revolutions. We're going through another one at the moment. So the fourth industrial revolution, IR4, transition to the knowledge economy. So I was curious. I was curious about we've got no manufacturing in Australia. It is 6% of GDP. Like that's not meaningless. So, but what's really interesting is what's happening in that space. So our manufacturing sector is not the same as the Chinese manufacturing sector. We cannot compete on this sort of cheap mass production of goods. But where we are is in this like looking at niche markets. So like we're into high quality production. Agribusiness is a part of our manufacturing sector that has taken off. So for example, we've got some homegrown companies in that space. So the Bundaberg soft drinks company. So these are competing with these like your craft sort of soft drinks sector. Phenomenally successful. So we have another one which is Calipio honey. Is that how we say it? So yeah. So again, another growth sector as well. We are huge in pet food. So, but we're not going to become a world power based on pet food and Capilano honey. No, but it's kind of where the trade advantages are. So manufacturing doesn't have to be about the mass production of goods. We are growing industries it's a niche high end of a production of goods. So with the pet food, so this is high end pet food. Now pet ownership in our near neighbours, is big. So we have a ready-made market on our doorstep. Interestingly, the people that are employed in this sector are in regional Australia, so they're not in our city centres, which is a good thing. So they are also older Australians. So not to offend anybody, so older Australians in this context means that they tend to be over the age of 45. So this is amazing. This is exactly what we want. We've got an ageing population who are looking for working opportunities as we segue out of one sort of manufacturing, growing in another area. We've got high regional unemployment in pockets. These industries offer a way out of it. We are got exceptional growth in advanced manufacturing. So this is our biotech industry. So we have phenomenal growth in other technologies as well. So it's not all about the production of mass goods. It's about the production and manufactured of specialist goods. And I promised myself I would not use this economics term. But it seems to be, or there are signals in the economy that Australia has a comparative advantage. And all that really means is we are quite good at nailing this end of the market, this specialist manufacturing space. So that requires a highly educated and competent workforce. We just cannot, you are absolutely correct. We cannot compete in manufacturing in China. But we still want the goods here.
But one of the things we are really good at is components and parts and pieces of wholes. So I think there are a lot of amazing companies in Queensland that produce very high-end, very high-tech components that go into major aircrafts, for example, around the world. They go into the Defence Force, they go into cars, they go into other parts, and that is all being done here in Queensland. But the challenge, I think, where I see with the tariff situation, when we all start to get into this competitive tariff, retaliatory tariff, is that those that are part of these complex supply chains are actually the ones that are impacted the most by this. So where we have, parts that, raw materials coming from Queensland may be going somewhere to be turned into an alloy or some other componentry part that will be then made into a product back in Queensland that will then get shipped off to a third party that then will go finally to the US to be put into the final vehicle, aircraft, whatnot. They're getting hit at every point of that process. And I think the US itself is seeing, the whole idea of having a manufacturing industry in the US, and you think about the car industry, and you think about, mines in, I don't know, Pennsylvania, somewhere on the East Coast that are producing raw materials. They're getting sent to Canada to be pressed and turned into something, down to Mexico, back to the US, back to Canada, back to Mexico, back to the US. That's all those tariffs just moving backwards and forwards for the manufacturing componentry that will be assembled and the final car made in a Detroit. So I think the intent on the tariff, the intent on bringing manufacturing home, whether it's our home, Trump's home, is to encourage that foreign direct investment, encourage the domestic investment in an industry. But at the moment, rightly or wrongly, we have these very wide globalised supply chains. And I think, what we have to look at is, okay, well, what does this new situation with tariffs actually do to those global supply chains? And, we can talk about where we are now. Queensland's recently run a series of roundtables with exporters, about 250 exporters, and the thing we're seeing the most is most exporters are not directly impacted by these tariffs for the most part, but those with the complex supply chains, or those that have parts, for example, a food company that's using aluminium packaging, because that aluminium is going to get hit with the tariff. Those are the people that are going to get impacted by these experiences. And I think,
Anna, can I get onto that a little later? The sort of the present and future. But I just want to go back firstly to the rush towards free trade, say over the last couple of decades, and it seems to me that part of the justification post World War II was that a way of getting peace in the world was to allow second world countries or third world countries to effectively trade their way out of their unhappiness, and to get into the game, and that world poverty would decrease, the West would be safer, and we'd all be happier. Just interested firstly in whether the panel think that was part of the rationale, and did it happen?
Oh, you go.
Yeah, I'd say yes, I definitely think that's part of the rationale, but I think if you look at the major places that set up those those free trade regimes with each other first, it wasn't necessarily to be trading with developing countries. It was trading with, it was Europe trading with itself so that it wouldn't go into World War III. It was America trading with Europe or trading with others. It was America investing in Japan, right? It was reaffirming the enemy into an ally so we would not have that situation with each other again. Russia wasn't part of that story. They did exactly the same thing inside their bloc, right? So I think if you look at what it expanded later to some of the other economies, but I think initially it was about bringing peace to those allies or those war-torn zones.
Yeah, I think obviously America, since its founding, was a highly protectionist nation, became more so after the Civil War. People often fail to appreciate that every single president on Mount Rushmore was in favour of tariffs. Abraham Lincoln famously said, "Give me a protective tariff and I'll give you the greatest nation on earth." Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States and a genius, wrote a paper on manufacturers, interestingly saying, we could get rich, we could just allow immigrants to come in from Europe and land would appreciate, and we don't need to go through the hard effort of building stuff here. You're welcome to Australia today. But no, as a sovereign nation, we need to build up things, so we're not relying on the dirty British or the other Europeans who could use that to influence our behaviour. It does affect our economic sovereignty. Post Second World War, America was so dominant. Europe had been decimated. I think America was producing about 40+% of the world's manufactured goods after the Second World War. So they could afford to, in order to reboot these nations, to drop its tariff walls gradually. They did so, after the Kennedy round in the 60s, and that was sensible. You can sort of adjust to the times, but post the Cold War, we sort of assumed that it was going to be the age of perpetual peace. And these discussions about producing pet food or components, they make sense if you're living in a global market and there are no borders. Imagine there's no borders. It's easy if you try, as John Lennon said, but it's a utopian notion. Nations compete with each other, and a nation that hollows itself out industrially will be more vulnerable from a national security perspective, and there'll also be social consequences because there's a certain proportion of the population that has aptitude for working in the technical areas, and if they can't do that here, but you're sending the jobs to Bangkok or Bangladesh or God knows where, there won't be the sort of jobs for them here. The industrial Midwest, the arsenal of democracy, won America the Second World War and won the North the Civil War. They were able to do that because of what they had there. They built up the greatest nation on earth industrially behind a tariff wall. J.D. Vance is from the Midwest, and that discussion in 2000 when I was in Shanghai, I remember sitting down with a colleague of mine who was also a newly minted university grad, and she was working for CNN. And we got down to this restaurant in Shanghai, and we're talking about the WTO and the entry, and we were all, it makes sense, on balance, it's going to help bring democracy and everything else. And the cameraman was at that restaurant, and he's like, it's going to be a disaster. I was like, really? It's just so against the grain of what I'm reading in Newsweek and watching on TV. And where are you from? I'm from Ohio. And it's always stuck with me because the jobs from that area just did ship out in vast. The factories did ship from that part of the world to in China, and that does matter.
Louisa, can I ask you? Free trade gave peace in our time. Was that right, wrong?
I guess it depends on what your definition of peace is. So have we avoided or World War III? So I think, many people will say that trade creates a preference for soft diplomacy. So because you do have this codependency between countries, and rather than hard diplomacy, where you don't want codependency because this creates an issue. So, Australia has played this game really, really well. So we've had some real tussles in that soft diplomacy space, particularly with China. So, and Australia's reaction to that has always to be quite staid in its retaliatory perspective and pivot in that space. So if you sort of think of the most recent, sort of like the wine ban is a really, really good example of that. So it was an awful situation for wine growers. So it was a very dependent market. China was huge for the wine industry. So, but it also so if people wanted to stay in that business, they had to look elsewhere. And one of the great things about the Australian wine industry, they proved to be extremely agile and extremely innovative in that space, finding new markets. Now, what was quite interesting is what happened when China opened back up to wine, because there had been a huge social shift in China. And generations were now coming through, and they were like, not really into wine anymore. So we're gravitating towards other drinks. But we had missed that. We had missed that transition or that fall off of that market because we had to move very, very swiftly to find new markets. Demand for wine in Australia, so the value of wine that we export is still up there, but the volume is a lot lower. How does that work? It's because the tastes for wine in China have got very, very expensive now, so they're looking at the premium wine exports. So in some ways, I have to say, Dan, I'm a bit of a glass half full kind of girl. I kind of sort of look at it from a retrospective perspective and go, potentially, like they actually put the wine industry in a good situation. Remember at that time, the position of the Australian government not to retaliate meant they supported the wine industry to find those new markets. So we were kind of all on board. But I have a question for Dan.
Please go for it.
So I don't know if I've misinterpreted you, and I think, I apologise because it may sort of like flip into your future things. But what are you so concerned is going to happen? Because there seems to be, underpinning your argument, seems to be it coming from a place of fear. And I think for me, I'm kind of interpreting that fear as like there's an enemy out there and we need to be mindful of that and we need to be preparing for something. Have I misread the situation?
Look, I'm an optimistic, sunny guy, and the new Trump talks about a new golden age. I mean, I think we can have a new golden age here in Australia. But look, the lessons of history show that you can't simply assume that you're living in an age of perpetual peace. I think Plato famously said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." Right? So, China is obviously much more of an industrial and technological power than it once was. Even if there's never a sort of traditional type of war, like I said before, more industrialised nations can exert dominance over other less industrialised nations. The reason why the United States is so powerful is because it has still cutting-edge technology in aviation and a whole loads of other things. But you do risk that, right? There was I was in Hong Kong at an Australia Day lunch, not unlike this, with people drinking heavily. Peter Costello said, I talk to these Americans and they're always worried about, the automobile industry moving to China, and I don't care, what does it really matter if the automobile moves to China? And I remember thinking to myself at that stage, are you for real? Like, if China produced all of America's cars, that would matter. Like that would mean that they, developed the technical skills, and it was the cars of Detroit, the auto, the factories and that produced the tanks that were able to help America win the war. So it's just a prudence that's required, given the lessons of history. It's not being overly dark. It's just saying that we've created a system, particularly in Australia, where we simply don't think we need to produce anything substantial, where we can just be a primary producer, and that's not what all the not what Sir Robert Menzies thought. It's not what, like I said, Abraham Lincoln thought. It's not what Sir John A. Macdonald, who was the founder of Canada, thought. It's not what the New Zealand's longest Prime Minister thought. But apparently, God bless the baby boomers, they're so full of confidence that they went to work and they thought, all these guys who went before, what did they really know? What are these little these tariff things? We can just get rid of those and everything will be fine and dandy. And I just think looking back on history, you can't assume that. I gave the example of Britain during the First World War. There were plenty of very adamant free trader types of the late 19th century, Richard Cobden and John Bright, who were famous for saying that free trade would usher in perpetual peace, and lest we forget, it did not.
Okay, well, President Trump didn't think that free trade was going to do that, and he's reacted quite obviously and strongly. Is he a madman? Is he a thoughtful responder to an issue? Is his policy sensible? Is it crazy? What's he all about? Anna, you might go first.
All of the above. I think and this is me thinking, this is not representing the Queensland government, the Australian government, this is me thinking. I do think there is a method there. Obviously, it's not an unfounded way of thinking, and it's not crazy in that sense. I think there's an intent there to recreate industry that may have disappeared, or to create the future industry that doesn't exist yet, but it should exist in America in his mind. And so I think these decisions are deliberately made to do that. And if you just take one perspective, this concept of you need to make this stuff in America. You need to come and you need to set up here and you need to manufacture here. Now, if only a tiny percentage of companies did do this, in fact, some of them have already announced. Many companies have already announced, I am opening factory X to manufacture Y here. That is a significant injection of foreign direct investment or even domestic investment into America that he's gotten simply from making some very bold announcements. People are prepared to act on that. It was similar under previous governments around their, I've forgotten what it's called now, but around their energy policy that they created. And I think if it only attracts a small percentage of companies, it's still a lot. It's still a lot. And then if you say, is this madness? No. But then the other part is, it is about a message as well. It's about a message about we don't believe that the current system works, and we're throwing it out, and we're letting you know that you can throw it out too. That's one part of a message. The second part of the message is also those of you that do things we don't like, you'll get worse treatment. So if you look at the list of tariffs and who's getting what, some tiny little islands in the Pacific have got some pretty big tariffs on them. Some of them have made some recent deals with some people that America's not as friendly with, and one could say that that's a foreign policy message to some of these countries. There are also some, weird little places out there that get, extra tariffs for no apparent reason than potential transshipment. But then the last part is it madness? In some cases, I think what we do have to bear in mind that is, unlike other presidents, Trump really does make decisions himself. I think, we're all used to in our democracies, governments that have key decision makers, but those decision makers have an army of people behind them giving them, really good advice. And there seems to be at a point where decisions are made, there's multiple layers of people being part of that decision-making process. I think what's unique about America is that the commander-in-chief really does make the final decision, and with Trump, he really does. So some of those decisions about particular places are being made by his gut feeling about that country, that person, that ambassador, whatever it might be, that does factor into it in some way. And I think we have been quite lucky as a country, long-standing relationships, very good advocates in the American government for us, which have seen us get a preferential position, but other countries have not been so lucky.
Louisa, mad decision, bad decision, dangerous to no decision. What do you say about it? Is there method to the madness?
As an academic, I can sit back and say it's like a really good real-world experiment. So how we traditionally measured things is by a set of metrics. So, does this increase our GDP, our production of stuff? So, does this increase employment? So, is inflation going to behave its stuff? What Trump has introduced as an economist, sort of basic 101 economic principles, you're kind of sort of it's not looking good long term against any of those metrics. So we would expect GDP not to grow as much. So it still may be positive, and your point is really well made. It potentially will temper employment. And I think, inflationary, yes, it will be inflationary. And, that combination of things, sort of, we start talking about recessions, which is never good. So as an economist, I'm kind of sort of like, well, is he crazy? So what's going on here? Or has he got simply a completely different set of KPIs? So he is actually not interested in growing the economy, growing employment, keeping inflation under control. And if it is none of those things, what is it? So is it pure hubris, for example? Or is it something else? Because he hasn't really revealed what that is. Or maybe we're just looking at it using the wrong KPIs. But the rest of us are still on we would like some growth. So we definitely want employment, and we want that inflation. So we've all experienced a bit of that, and we realise that, it is the middle child. So we kind of ignore it when it's behaving well. But when it rears its head, it is really ugly. And it impacts everybody. So I don't know what his game plan is, but he has changed the rules. But he hasn't been clear about what his measurement of success is either.
Well, luckily Dan does know what the game plan is. So what is it?
Well, this is something that frustrates me a little bit, and part of the reason why I set up this institute is that there's so much of a focus on the antics of Trump and the personality. And, I accept it's an acquired taste. Sometimes he's funny, sometimes he's cringe-inducing. Welcome to the internet. That's what happens. He's a creature of that age, in a weird way, given his age. But it's simply not correct to think that there's not a coherent framework for this. Like I said, the vast majority of US presidents on trade policy thought the same, as did the ones in Australia, as did the ones in every other Anglo jurisdiction, right? Just look at what they're reading, and they won't be putting it in quite the sort of rambunctious, flamboyant style of Trump, but they'll be saying exactly the same thing. Robert Lighthizer was Trump's first US trade representative. That guy knows more about trade policy than anyone, all the trade ministers in the world combined. Read his book. I mean, he talks about, they crafted quite a sophisticated rejigging of NAFTA with the Canada and Mexico. The tariffs that they introduced on China were maintained during the Biden administration. So in Australia, again, we focus too much on the Trump. We don't fully appreciate the United States on a bipartisan basis is never going to allow tariff-free trade with China anymore for the foreseeable future. Whereas here, oh, Trump, bad, orange man. Oh, let's continue to have 100% manufactured goods coming from China duty-free because we haven't adjusted. We haven't thought about trade policy in a serious way. So whatever. Trump he will come and go. He's only there for another 2.5 years. But thoughtful people like a J.D. Vance, who grew up in Ohio and saw all those factories go and saw the deprivation that it caused, he's reflective of broader American sentiment. He's a thoughtful guy, as are all of the people that are now forming part of the administration. I mean, they are some of the most accomplished financial and technologically successful executives in the world. Scott Bessant, he used to run a hedge fund for George Soros. These guys know the implications of finance and trade, and they have been convinced. Not because of any personal loyalty to Trump. He was a kind of battering ram which sort of threw light on the devastation and the need for a reassessment about trade policy. But now the cavalry or the reinforcements have arrived to provide a much more coherent framework so that people throughout the departments aren't just relying on the whims of the resident of the White House, but implementing in a whole new thing. And that we just frustratingly, that has not occurred here in Australia, and that needs to occur here.
We'll get to the big policy, but I do want to ask you, because you're in the front line here, there does seem to be a difficulty, not necessarily in dealing with the policy itself, but in the changing nature of
Yeah,
the
I
policy.
think-
Can you tell us anything about that without giving too many secrets away?
No, I would argue that actually while the concept, I guess, and the strategy does have a framework, the decisions are made before the policy is developed. And so there are announcements that get made before the departments have even been able to work out how that might work or be implemented. And then they're given a deadline to get it out by the date that it was announced. So they're writing it, over 48 hours, no sleep and a lot of coffee, I'm guessing, to get that up and ready to go so that companies around the world that want to trade with America are able to follow what this new regulation looks like. And I think that is, forgetting the tariffs, I think that's the challenge for the US right now. It's not necessarily a tariff and a percentage and a value. It's what is the process by which I follow it, how, I've got my forecast that I'm trying to, decide whether I'm going to trade with you, I'm going to keep my partnership going, I'm going to meet your requirements, and I can't do it because I don't know what they are.
Yeah, I mean, just in some ways that encourages investment in the United States, because if there's uncertainty about precisely the terms on which you're able to trade with the United States, well, you avoid that problem by setting up a factory in the United States. So,
yeah, but half your parts are not going to come from there domestically. So you're still going to run into the same issues. Like there's nothing that can be done from out of the ground and off the shelf really yet in the foreseeable future.
Well, this is the issue. You want a much more broad-based industrial capacity in a nation. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day saying that in Texas they had trouble finding someone that could produce a coat hanger. And people are like, well, it doesn't matter, we'll just get our coat hangers from China or Mexico or something. But, at some point you need a coat hanger.
Yeah.
Or if someone can produce a coat hanger, they can produce something else more sophisticated, and you develop within that ecosystem new innovations in technologies, where if you don't have that, you lose it. Look, the goal, Trade and Investment Queensland, is investment as well as trade. If you have a tariff wall, it encourages people to invest behind in the country, because then you avoid the tariff. So it actually encourages investment in a nation. So that's the sort of broad rationale that Trump is operating under. It may not be completely economically optimum, because if you could get it from North Korea, well, why not get it from North Korea? It's cheaper. But there's a coherence to that, right? Because once the more sophisticated jobs of factories are there, you do actually build out a much more skilled workforce, and you have more economic sovereignty. And yes, I accept that the whole way this has been ushered in is involved a certain amount of chaos. They're moving fast and breaking things, in the words of I think Mark Zuckerberg, right? But it's sort of no other way to do it. And it's the birth pangs of a new trading order, and we need to not sort of grumble and think it'll all go away, but recognise that the previous system was, like I said, utopian, and the new one will be structured differently, and the answers will be structuring more sophisticated ways of engaging with the United States and other people, and disengaging or decoupling from places like China and elsewhere, and having more factories and high-tech manufacturing and broad-based manufacturing established in places like Ipswich and Townsville and Geelong and all the rest of it. Whereas at the moment, because you've got open borders trade in Australia, why establish a factory here? Like, have it in Bangladesh and then just sell your product into this market with duty-free.
I think one of the biggest challenges in attracting FDI here, and particularly in a manufacturing base, is that we don't have a large enough domestic market to sell the product. So the ultimate goal for most of our foreign direct investors is export. So then we're back to tariffs. So I think, that is a really important thing for us to consider when we're looking at FDI into Australia, anywhere in Australia, not just Queensland.
Just for everybody, FDI is
foreign direct investment. Yeah, sorry, going to a lingo. So if you're trying to attract foreign companies to come establish a manufacturing facility, most of them are not looking at us. But that's not to say that's a bad thing, as long as we maintain favourable trading relationships with major markets. So it could be with ASEAN, it could be with the US, it could be with China, it could be with a number of regions or countries out there. If we maintain those favourable trading relationships through soft diplomacy and other means, then yes, we do become a favourable place for foreign direct investment because they can export from us to those markets. That has been one of the major reasons that we have been able to attract FDI in recent years at the way we have because of our FTA regime. We're currently in a good favourable place with the US. We're actually benefiting in many ways from some of these tariffs because we have the lowest tariff globally. The lowest tariff anyone can have at the moment is 10%. That's what we've got. So we're in a really good place to attract people who want to invest here to do partial manufacturing because they're only going to pay a 10% rate for some of the things that they're looking at by sending it to the US, which might be their ultimate market, as well as other markets that they want to do in the region. So, I think right now it's important for us to have multiple favourable trading relationships because that's what's going to get us that.
But okay, the big one is the China FTA. I remember it being negotiated, all the fanfare, and I've watched closely the statements of those, Tony Abbott and others and they talk about that in a weird way. They're completely all over the shop. At one stage, Tony Abbott says it's the trade arrangements with China should be on the basis of reciprocity. Where our technology goes, their technology should go, and vice versa. Well, guess what, man? That's not the agreement you signed. You can't set up a TikTok-like online company in Shanghai, but you can do that here. We sold, and I had a discussion with James Lawrence, an economist from UTS, and he's like, oh, well, trade has increased so much, but the vast majority of the value of the trade we sell to China is iron ore and coal, other things. That trade existed prior to a trade agreement. The real thing that has happened is that it's allowed China to send 100% manufactured goods into Australia. So, yes, okay, it's great for Harvey Norman, maybe it's great for electronic retailers, but it means that you won't be able to produce that yourself. And we haven't, all the dreams that were sold for that FTA, that we would be selling additional services and product, insurance and legal services and the rest of it, they just haven't eventuated. So you've got to get real and reassess.
But I think we have to look at more than, it's not just a bilateral Australia-China or Australia-US and US-China. There's so many other markets out there that are looking at us right now because we do have this I guess, unique position. We do have a favourable relationship with China, we do have a favourable relationship with the US, and we've got quite good relationships with a lot of economies, and potentially, Europe coming up, that's the next conversation. It doesn't have to be FTAs. I think, that's the current regime that we're operating in, but as we're seeing, some of that's being thrown out. Even with the situation that Trump is creating, we still have a favourable trading relationship with the US.
But there's no cause for reflection about the agreement we've signed with China? Because the attitude of guys from DFAT, and I know them pretty well because on the Australia-China Council Board, is that it should be an ever closer engagement with China in a whole host of other ways, and that the FTA is sacrosanct. And China's just the most obvious example because it's the one that people recognise poses some type of potential military threat, notwithstanding the sunny outlook of others. But you have to if it makes sense for the United States to be doing this on a bipartisan basis, why no reflection here? It's weird.
I don't think that there is no reflection.
No change.
Well, that doesn't mean there's no reflection.
I think we're just seeing this start now, right? So the other part that's really important is we don't have to jump to America's tune straight away. Going back to this point, look what happened with China's economic coercion. We had to start thinking about what we were going to do, who else we're going to trade with. It opened up a lot of opportunities for us with other markets as a result. It's not to say that that is not evolving in the back end right now. It's not to say that we're not looking at what's going on with the US, and I'm not speaking on behalf of DFAT because I've never worked for DFAT in my life, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But I'm just saying, I think there are thoughts going on around this, and I think everyone in the world, not just Australia, everyone in the world is looking at what's happening and considering, well, what does this mean for us?
And is that any clearer yet for us? I mean, do we know what we're going to do in response?
Can I just cut in, because I'm stuck on the coat hanger. Okay,
Yes.
so because the coat hanger was at one point really important. So because we need coat hangers, so we have to make our coat hangers. I have a 17-year-old son. He doesn't use coat hangers. So, which is it? But that's interesting, hey? So he doesn't use coat hangers, which releases him, because he's not spending time buying coat hangers and hanging clothes up, to utilise another way to do his... he doesn't fold them, he just drops them on the floor. So it's fast, there's a degree of efficiency to it, and it allows them to be more productive in other space. So not having the coat hanger, maybe that's a good thing. Do you know?
Just
Like
watching-
maybe
Before we go down the coat hanger rabbit hole,
So-
I think Simon is in the audience somewhere. I think where's Simon? So I'll just, Simon, I think you're getting questions together. I might just ask our panel, just before we go to questions, is there anything burning that we've missed or you want to say before we throw the floor open? Anyone?
Look, the thing I'd say is we need to realise this is an opportunity, right? This isn't all doom and gloom. We've seen our beef exports increase to the US as a result of tariffs, because our biggest competitor to the US is Brazil for beef, and their tariffs 55%. So we're seeing, interest in investors who were looking at other parts of the world who are now being hit with greater tariffs, coming and looking at Australia instead, and Queensland specifically. So I think we need to remember this is not just about us in America or us in China, and we need to realise that actually this is creating a lot of opportunities for us as a state and as a country to benefit from it.
Yeah, I just add, major point is that there's a legitimate different philosophy, I call it trade realism, which needs to be reconsidered in Australia, which is not to say tariffs are always and everywhere fantastic. Trade policy can be done well, it can be done poorly. Tariffs can be done well or done poorly. And the new world we're living in will require sophisticated sort of tacking and thinking with different partners and a reassessment of long-standing agreements. And I think the introduction of tariffs and some sort of wall here in Australia. But we can't continue with this sort of 1980s doctrinaire purist approach that where we stamp our feet and go, why can't we return to what we had then? Because it's not happening and was arguably flawed from the beginning.
Louisa, anything to say as a final?
There's not an easy answer. So we are a small country. So we have a limited labour supply. We have some incredibly complex social issues that we are attempting to deal with. So if we limit ourselves to our domestic market, so life will look substantially different. Employment will look substantially different. Wages will look substantially different. So there's a sort of a trade premium on salaries, and sort of like you see figures are quoted of between 7 and 9%. We are better off as wage earners, and 1 in 4 jobs in Australia are connected to that trade. So there is a lot to recommend. So engaging in world trade, there is a lot of benefit to soft diplomacy moving forward as well. So.
Thank you, Louisa. Simon, what have we got?
Thanks, Ian. I've had about 75 questions so far, I think. Jane Wilson wants to remind you about Smoot-Hawley and those tariffs which perhaps helped kick off the Great Depression. I suspect that's just a sidebar. There's been a lot of questions about what industries do you think we should be sheltering behind a tariff wall. The car industry is probably gone, but how high would the tariffs have to be, for example, for us to have a viable car industry? And significantly, what would consumers think about that? Because I think consumers have been the big beneficiaries of having very low tariff walls. Let me just also say that all of the questions will go up after this meeting's over, and that Max is here as well with, so if you've got a question you want to ask physically, please do. Thanks, Ian.
Whoever.
Well, let's do Smoot Hawley first. Smoot Hawley is always rolled out as supposedly the cause of the Great Depression. Milton,
Can you just explain it?
Milton, it was the introduction of a higher tariff rate in the United States in the just before the Great Depression, but Milton Friedman, the famous free market economist, he didn't think that caused the Great Depression. He thought the cause was the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, and also the tariffs that were introduced under Smoot Hawley were actually far less than existed during the period from the end of the Civil War until 1913, which was when you saw the massive rise of industrial power in the United States. So how can it be that tariffs, the introduction of tariffs at Smoot Hawley, which were less on average than that post-Civil War period, caused a Great Depression, but during the Great Depression when they were higher, they were massively favourable to the United States, and you saw an economic boom. So that's just, it inevitably comes up, but it is worth kind of getting the history and knocking that one on the head. With respect to what sort of tariff rate would be required to re-establish an automobile industry in Australia, I mean, we did have an automobile industry in Australia when we had a much smaller domestic market. We did have tariffs which prevented British manufactured goods coming in, and there are exceptions, and there are like a lot of sophistication about carve-outs for a variety of different things to take into account, the different specialist parts that you might need. But the question isn't so much as like asking what particular rate. Like the average rate of the tariffs in Australia was about 30% in the post World War II to beginning of the sort of when Gough Whitlam introduced cut tariffs about 25%. So 30%, at least in theory, can sustain a automobile industry in Australia. Whether that would actually happen in today's market is an open question. I know this is a long answer, but it's almost like saying, when people say, Dan, tell me the rate that's required, it's like saying, well, what's the rate of personal income tax that is required to establish a dynamic economy? It can vary, and it can depend. It's subject to debate and a whole lot of variety. What's the correct capital gains tax rate that's required? There's a whole lot of other sort of tax rates and policy questions that are involved in these discussions. But the example I use when people always say that tariffs are this antiquated type of thing, a public policy measure which is always crude and doesn't give great results, is like, well, the Apple App Store is a platform where if you want to get in and sell in that market, you effectively share with Apple a proportion of your sales. All analogies leak, but it's somewhat similar to that. We established this platform called Australia, a well-regulated, affluent market. If you want to come in here, or you want to try sell goods here, we will impose a tax on you before you're able to access that market. And that's very much in line with I mean, it sort of makes sense, right? We've established all these beautiful roads and buildings and well-regulated judiciary and everything else. You can't just come in and utilise that to sell your goods without having paying some cost to that. But that's what you can do if you don't have to be located here, and you can locate yourself in, God knows, Bangladesh or God knows, or wherever. Long-winded question, sorry. I noticed that a lot of mums here were tearing their hair out about their sons not using code.
So I guess, so how much is the car going to cost?
Well, I mean, likely more, but there's a unrealised cost which is not being imposed at the moment when you rely on China producing all your cars. Because in the event, I don't know, some pandemic arose and you suddenly had to boot up masks and everything else from scratch in a hurry, there's a greater cost to that, trying to do it at speed. And that's just masks and ventilators and stuff. Imagine if you're trying to, in a hurry, boot up, I don't know, coat hangers to hang your army uniform on, or boots that you need to put on to march off to the front. You may not even be able to do it because you haven't developed the skills domestically to be able to do it. So you just can't, this reliance on foreign nations for everything. I'm not talking about, Australia becoming North Korea and shutting off trade to the world. That's never really been the argument. It's a prudent approach to engagement on trade internationally, not operating on the basis of perpetual peace or this doctrinaire assumption that any tax on a good crossing a border is somehow some antiquated oddball notion.
Anna, you have your microphone rampant.
Can I just respond? Because you are alluding to an Australia of yore when you talk about the sort of manufacturing industry. So it's cars, so boots on our troops. I mean, there's a recognition that like modern warfare, so is not going to be troops on the ground. It's not going to be tanks. It's not going to be planes in the sky. It's going to be, done at your desktop, flying in unmanned drones, so like cyber attacks, etc. So I think maybe my glass is half full because my view of the future, and what manufacturing looks like in the future, the sort of goods that we're producing, these high-end goods, like how we deal with some of the social issues that we've got in Australia, how we deal with sort of our productivity lulls, are things that I think are important. I think trade is one of the least of our concerns at the moment, and I think you've made that point really, really eloquently. So, but your references seem to be to a manufacturing industry of 20 years ago. So it's not a manufacturing industry that I think is emerging in the world, in this economy. We've got a particular skill set in Australia that makes us particularly good at producing goods and services. So that are not these I can touch it, therefore it has value and it's mass produced. So I think that's why I'm having real difficulty sort of leaning into your position, because I really don't understand what your vision is here for Australia. I'm a very visual thinker.
Oh, you're just an old-fashioned guy now.
Yeah.
What's the story?
Well, I often encounter these types of arguments where people, glass in hand, say they're glass half full and manufacturing, it's old school manufacturing. And then I ask them, where did the glass come from? Well, that's obviously produced in China because we don't produce glass anymore. I mean, there's certain base requirements that you need to function. I mean, our shoes, our clothes, everything else. Yes, the high-tech manufacturing is great. It's great that Apple is now repatriating its production of iPhones to the United States. It's great that those high-tech jobs are no longer produced in Shenzhen and the rest of it, or at least that's what the aim of it is. But I still think there's this utopian kind of notion to it all, where you don't need coat hangers, you don't need this, that, and the other.
I think we can agree you don't need coat hangers, so we're all good.
Well, I mean, do you need fish hooks? Because we're an island nation. Now, that's steel. It's actually kind of hard to produce a fish hook. It's pretty useful though. You can catch fish and the rest of it. Now, but if you can't produce steel, you can't just conjure that from scratch. And if you're relying on a factory in Foshan in southern China to produce those, you can't. If for whatever reason that is cut, then where does it come? Where does it come from? Where does this fish hook come from anymore? You can't just wish it into being. This is the kind of, I mean, it's very practical. Political leaders over the years that were focused on the need for for a realistic trade policy. Alexander Hamilton and George Washington during the War of Independence, they relied a lot pre-war on British goods, all the manufactured goods that used to came in from the UK. But when they were in a war with Britain, you can't get those materials. You can't get bullets. You can't get all the things that you needed in the Valley Forge.
Let's give Anna a go at this one. Because
I mean, and yet they won the war. Yeah. I think as a country, we have a lot of the raw materials required to do most of the things we need to do. Yes, we send them off, but I guess back to that original question, like what industry should we be creating? What industry should we be protecting? And I guess it goes down to how far down that value chain do we go? Do we go to fish hooks and coat hangers, or do we go to steel or green steel? How far do we go? No one could have ever imagined that we would need to be making masks, right? But I can tell you, as a diplomat overseas, I spent months calling companies buying masks for Australia to be sent home because we didn't have any here. So then you go, oh, we need a company that can produce masks quickly. But the next thing that we had to find was the material to make the masks. And the next thing we had to find, and the next thing we had to find. And that was real jobs that me and my team actually had while the pandemic was going on around the world. It's not, so I think the original question still stands, and I don't think anyone here can answer that. I think it's a good question, but it's an almost unfair question to the group here, because I think that comes down to national and state policy about what is the most important things to have at a sovereign risk level that you would then ensure that you can do. It's not necessarily coat hangers and fish hooks, but maybe it is steel, for example. So I think if we're going down that path, we do need to think of that as a country. I do think some of these cyber protections are critical for us to have for ourselves, because we do have a lot of friends, but our friends are not always our friends. So we really do need certain things for ourselves, and I would say there are some things that I do believe we should be protecting at home. But I don't know if I would go so far as to say that even, we need to produce masks. Who would have imagined what we went through with COVID? I don't think most people do.
I think we just spoke with Simon. You said you had 75 questions, so that's one down, 74 to go. So we take. Oh yes, someone with a hand up here. Thank you.
Right. Sorry, do I stand up? You get. Well, I can hold. Murray, congratulations on the dialogue. First time I've been to one in Brisbane. Thank you, Steve and Jane, for having me. 2 points. The first is, I'm going to ask a question. Before I ask the question, can I say that the greatest ally, the strongest ally Australia has is the United States. So I would say, as I've said to others before, that I think that we should show respect and trust in the United States. It's been our strongest military ally, and it's the strongest economy as a free democracy in the world. It's not a communist regime, and the President of the United States, some people call him Trump, with disrespect. He is the president in the same way that President Kennedy, President Eisenhower, President Reagan were duly elected by a democracy, by their people, as the leader of a nation to which we have been almost in every war for the last 100 years. Now you ask yourself the question, what does Australia have to trade with President Trump? He's a businessman. And think of him as a businessman that wants to trade a deal. What do we have in Australia that we can trade positively, not negatively? Rather than complain about him, look positively forward as to what we can do as a nation, and perhaps, is South Wales rules, Murray? Is that right? South Wales rules? No, it's not. It's not going on a public record. This is not a public record. Australia enjoys 28% of the reserves of the world's uranium, much of which is lying idle in the ground. We also have precious minerals. There's one mineral we have that China does not have. Do you know what it's called? Niobium. Niobium. There you are, Jane. Niobium is a light steel alloy which is used to make bridges, but China does not have it. Brazil has most of it in the world, but Australia has that to trade. We have uranium to trade. So we go to the United States and we trade uranium coupled with precious earth minerals in exchange for increased military presence in Australia on an uninhabited land. That is a deal. That is a valuable deal that you might consider addressing in the panel tonight.
Thank you. Panel, is there a response or a thought?
There will need to be a restructuring of the trade arrangement with the United States, because the current free trade agreement that we negotiated with them is no longer being honoured. It's no longer enforceable because they've imposed tariffs. So one way or another, that will need to be restructured. Precisely the terms of what will look like need to be thought through. We have an ambassador in Washington who probably should be on that case. Yep.
I would say is, and I would say that.
Sorry, Anna.
Sorry, I think I don't think anyone's debating that the US is and has been our strongest ally since World War II, and has remained so. And in fact, we have been in every war with them to date, whether they wanted us to be or not. So I think, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Simon.
Nobody answered the previous question about what Australian consumers would think of tariffs. And related to that, Jean Tunney wonders what would happen to the economic well-being of Australians if we had high tariff levels. And was the economic well-being of Australians, did it slip during previous high tariff regimens?
Any thoughts?
Well, as Jean would know, it doesn't make sense to just look at one side of the ledger. We only produced, like 60,000 private sector jobs over the last financial year. So one advantage of having a tariff regime would be that there's more investment and manufacturing here, and that produces, generally speaking, higher paid jobs who can then afford more than they once were able to before. We did live under, from the end of the Second World War until about the 70s, in a situation where unemployment was low. We had a very broad-based industrial economy. We produced cars, we produced all manner of things. We had cheap power. There were particular sort of global circumstances which led to that. But the idea that a tariff regime is in and of itself terrible is simply not borne out by history or our own experience. And again, you do have to look at this not purely, even if the argument was that it would be economically optimised, am I getting the kind of economic language right, to not have any tariffs on any goods crossing a border ever. You're living in a world which will never exist and has never existed. So the globe will never be one global free trade zone. There will always be nations competing industrially as well as militarily against each other, and nations do owe an obligation to their own citizens. We're not creating this the goal of Australia shouldn't be to be a free trade zone like Dubai. We're a nation. We have obligations to our own people. We have a need for our own industrial capacity. And the question about whether we should produce fishhooks or coat hangers or this, that, and the other, it misses the point in this respect. You want a broad-based industrial capacity so that if you need to turn your mind to producing masks, you can do that without having the good people at Trade and Investment Queensland ringing up every factory in the world to try and get some.
That was when I was in the federal system, but yes. Yeah.
Louisa, did you have a comment on the question that was put, the consumer impact?
So, tariffs are a tax, and you put tax on imports and the price goes up. So as a result of that, so it's not necessarily, it's like inflation is persistent price increases. It's a one-off price increase, potentially, unless you get, and this is the problem, unless you get into a tariff war where that prices do go up. But that reduces your capacity to spend your income as a consumer on other goods and services. So there seems to, I don't know if I'm sort of like misunderstanding the points you're making, but we don't have an unemployment crisis in Australia. In fact, if we look to the future, we've got a reducing working population that has to service an ageing population. So when we talk about well-being, yeah, we have real choices to make. So which way do we go? So what are we going to put people to work to? At the moment, we know that services, like healthcare services, that's on an upward trajectory. So that's a source of employment, putting money in people's pockets, putting money in the pockets of people who traditionally didn't have access to the workforce because it was manufacturing, and that manufacturing was very traditional, 9-to-5 jobs, wasn't attractive to females entering the workplace. Healthcare is, education is. So we're tapping into this resource. Like, women, as a result of that, are better serviced going into their older age. So they have pension to buy goods and services. So it's complex. There are no easy answers. And for every decision that we make, do we want manufacturing? It's kind of like, well, what are we giving up as a result of that? What are going to be the unintended consequences of that decision making?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about intended and unintended consequences, because a lot of the time also, if you go back to tariffs or agreements, whether they're free trade agreements or other kinds of bilateral, multilateral agreements, are also done for policy basis, like foreign policy basis, like bringing countries closer together, sending a message, getting us as a nation to get behind a policy that a government might have, and the opposite government doing the same thing with their people to get more close to us. You also have to ask yourself if we and again, I'm not against some protections. I think they're required in some industries, but I think if we create, a sense of barrier, where does it end? Like, who would have ever imagined that in this federation we would close our borders to each other? There were goods and services that could not move across the country. I had investors calling me to go talk to their HQs while I was living in Germany, German companies that manufacture here, who it was easier for them to get a product from Thailand to Melbourne than from Queensland to Melbourne. And I was having to explain to HQ why that was happening. So that's us protecting ourselves, right? There were decisions made to protect ourselves. We have to think, where does it begin? Where does it end? There are some reasons we do things, and they are there for good reasons. And then sometimes we create a culture of fear amongst ourselves too. So there's when a government, like going back to your point, if you talk about the China FTA, if taking your line of argument, everyone's bought into this FTA that may or may not be good, right? You're saying it's not good, everyone's bought into it. There's this narrative that it's fantastic when it's not. It can be the other way around too, right? You can believe a narrative that something is terrible when it's not. So we have to look at both sides of it, and I think there is something in questioning our regimes that we have and evaluating them. I think that's important. But I think we have to do that on both sides. We have to ask when sometimes we're creating fear or we're creating positivity where there may not be all the benefits or all the issues that we think there are.
Thank you. Simon, are we getting close to last questions, do you think? All right.
Thank you. My question was to Dan. Dan, I know you have this kind of reverence. I know you mentioned that a lot of the presidents that are on Mount Rushmore, they're all in favour of tariffs. Just on that topic, are we forgetting the fact that in those days of those presidents that there would have been genuine jobs created domestically by the introduction of a tariff, and that because technological advancements are so widespread these days, that any jobs that would be created in 2025 are just going to be people pushing a button as opposed to people working these, nostalgic manufacturing jobs?
Look, the goal isn't to create the economy of the 1950s. The goal is to create an economy which has industrial capacity, much more industrial capacity to produce a whole range of different things than we currently do. In the 1950s, we could, because we had, unlike many other nations, we had everything apart from things like rubber, which you had to import. We could produce everything that we needed. It wasn't at the most optimum cost, potentially, but so you want a broad-based industrial capacity. That's the goal. It's not to produce the 1950s economy. I'm not sure what more to say beyond that. The one point that I would make is that this line that tariffs are a tax, yes, they are a tax, but the political class in Australia today are quite odd, because they'll talk about every other type of tax. We need to increase the GST or cut back on negative gearings, or maybe a wealth tax or a capital gains tax changes. When tariffs were cut in the 1980s, we introduced a whole lot of new range of taxes, fringe benefits tax, everything else. So what you've really done is you're taxing people more directly in Australia. Even income taxes, which did come down, now cut in at sort of 2.5. The highest rate cuts in at 2.5 average weekly earnings, which is a lot lower than it did under Menzies' time. And Abraham Lincoln, God bless him, who was a very strong trade realist, he said the tariff is a simpler regime because it's just collected on the border with goods coming across. If you don't have that, what you'll have is swarms of Egyptian-like locusts going across the country, assessing people and taxing them directly. Well, that's what we live in today in a broad way. And so, I'm going on a little bit, but it's not an optimum situation for production in Australia today. And the only industries that now remain in this country, by and large, are things that can't be shifted offshore: mining, real estate, tourism, and the ancillary services like banking and some of the legal stuff, and your cafe, which supports the hardworking economists like Gene Tunney there nodding his head.
In defence of modern manufacturing, it's not just a button press in a fully automated factory. I mean, obviously, we have our university student here studying mechatronics. That's exactly what we need, more mechatronic engineers across this country, because software development, the actual development of the fully automated line, it requires huge numbers of people, installation, mechanics coming in and checking. There is people standing, often watching it go, whether they're physically watching it on the factory floor or they're watching it from a distance somewhere else. I've been in fully automated factories. They do require still lots of humans. It's just the skill set's gone up. And for a country like ours, where we're going to have huge skill shortages in the future, we have the potential to produce more than we can ever do ourselves. That's the kind of industry we want to be developing, because that's the kind that our population will be able to support.
I think the bar is calling. There's a 10% tariff on G&T, but otherwise it's clear. It's amazing, I think, as I asked Isabel to come up, that coat hangers took such a centre stage, and it is, of course, an iconic view for Australia. And as we depart, we can probably think of the Opera House and a large coat hanger just in front of it there, just to send us on our way with a very Australian feel. Isabel.
Thank you, panellists, for that wonderful and insightful discussion. It's definitely left me wondering if maybe we need a whole nother big dialogue on how do we keep industry here in Australia, of advanced industry in the future. But thank you so much for giving generously your time, expertise, especially Ian, who has provided one of the single most important ingredients of a dialogue, which is excellent moderation of difficult discussions. Let us show our appreciation to all of the speakers in the traditional manner. It's now my pleasure to invite you to carry on the discussion online using a proven, powerful AI-guided chat platform called Sway. So I think there was lots of questions left, and this might be a good way for you to ask those questions with other people. So for the first time, it has been offered for use in a public discussion event. Time constraints limit audience participation at big dialogues, and Sway addresses this. It holds the promise of enabling guests or participants in dialogue events to carry on the discussion in a suitably scaffolded way, in depth, and for longer than we can do here and at the bar afterwards. Please take a moment to strike while the iron is hot and register now using the QR code or link you can see on the sheets of paper on your table. That's the dialogues.swaybeta.ai/tariffs. You will be matched with someone with a different or opposite view of one of the topics you'll see. For example, the government should provide direct subsidies to Australian steel and aluminium producers rather than imposing protective tariffs. And the AI will guide you and get you started and continue to support you in the discussion in various ways. You can then chat when it suits you, just like SMS or WhatsApp, and we'll let it run for about a week. Based on a trial conversation with another volunteer I had on the Israel and Gaza topic, I think you'll find it's very interesting and a really positive experience. If you can't register now, don't miss the pioneering opportunity to do it later tonight or tomorrow so you can be matched and start chatting. Volunteers, event partners, and premium ticket holders are now invited to join speakers in the lower bar at the right, and everyone else is welcome to stay and carry on the discussion at the What's Golden bar on the other side until the lovely TIV staff tell us that it's time to go home. Thanks again to everybody for your contribution to this occasion and discussion tonight. Please carry it on at home, work and with friends, and online with someone on Sway. Travel safe. Good night.